She ignored her paralyzed Korean Mafia boss Fiancé, but Black Maid treated him like a king. Why would one person turn away while another chose to show respect? Could a single act of kindness make a difference when everything else seems to have changed? Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy powerful stories about compassion, dignity, and the choices that define who we are, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Thank you for spending your time with us and for supporting this channel with your views, comments, and encouragement. Before we begin, let us know in the comments. Do you believe true character is revealed by how we treat people during their hardest moments? Now let us step into today's unforgettable story and discover how one quiet decision can change everything. The moment people stop seeing your strength is often the moment they reveal who they truly are. More than 200 guests filled the grand ballroom of the Hamford estate, where crystal chandeliers scattered warm golden light across polished marble floors and tuxedoed servers moved silently between tables dressed with white roses and fine silver. Laughter floated through the air like carefully rehearsed music, blending with the gentle notes of a string quartet, positioned beneath towering windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Every detail spoke of wealth, influence, and absolute control. Yet at the center of that celebration, the man who owned everything seemed almost invisible. Ethan Romano sat alone in his custom wheelchair near the enormous windows, dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit that still fit him with the effortless elegance of a king. His dark hair was perfectly combed, his expression calm, his pale hands resting quietly on the armrests. Months earlier, powerful executives had waited hours for the privilege of speaking with him. Entire organizations measured their decisions by his approval. Tonight, guests passed within a few feet of him without offering more than polite nods before turning their attention toward the woman standing beneath the sparkling lights. Victoria Hayes smiled effortlessly as photographers captured every graceful movement. Her diamond engagement ring caught the light each time she raised her champagne glass, and she accepted compliments with practiced charm. Whenever someone asked where Ethan was, she simply gestured vaguely across the room before returning to another conversation, another laugh, another carefully posed photograph. She never once looked back to see whether he needed anything. Ethan noticed every glance that avoided him, every conversation that stopped just short of including him, every uncomfortable silence people wrapped in fake courtesy. Months ago, after the accident had taken the use of his legs, something far more painful had quietly disappeared. It wasn't his authority. It wasn't his fortune. It was the way people looked into his eyes. They no longer saw the man. They only saw the chair. Across the ballroom, the household staff worked with quiet precision, careful never to interrupt the evening's flawless appearance. Among them was Naomi Carter, the newest housemaid, whose simple black uniform contrasted sharply against the luxury surrounding her. Unlike everyone else, she had never known the Ethan Romano who commanded rooms simply by walking into them. She had started working only 3 weeks earlier. To her, he was not a legend whispered about by security guards or executives. He was simply the quiet gentleman who always thanked every employee by name. As she carried a silver tray toward the dining hall, she noticed something no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. Ethan's untouched dinner had been sitting on the nearby table for almost 40 minutes. The soup had begun to cool. The bread had hardened. Even the glass of sparkling water remained untouched. Guests continued celebrating only a few steps away, while the guest of honor sat completely alone. Naomi hesitated for only a second before placing her tray on a nearby serving station. Ignoring the subtle warning look from another employee, she walked directly toward him with calm, unhurried steps. Ethan heard the soft sound of approaching shoes and expected another staff member asking whether he needed to be moved for another photograph. Instead, a gentle voice broke through the noise surrounding them. "Good evening, sir," Naomi said with a warm smile that carried neither pity nor fear. "Your dinner is getting cold. Would you like me to bring you a fresh plate? Or would you rather enjoy some fresh air first?" Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward her. For the first time that entire evening, someone had spoken to him as though he were still the man making the choice instead of the burden everyone quietly managed. Around them, the laughter continued. Cameras flashed. Glasses clinked together. But for a single silent moment beside those towering windows, the forgotten king felt something he had almost lost forever. Respect. The silence following Naomi's simple question lingered far longer than either of them expected. Ethan studied her face, searching for the familiar signs he had learned to recognize over the past year. Pity, fear, awkward obligation. Instead, he found only quiet patience. She was waiting because she genuinely expected him to answer for himself. Before he could respond, another maid hurried over with concern written across her face. "Naomi," she whispered carefully, "Miss Hayes is looking for you. Leave Mr. Romano. Someone else will take care of him." Naomi glanced toward Victoria, who was laughing beside several prominent business families without once looking in Ethan's direction. Then she looked back at Ethan. "Would you prefer to stay here, sir, or enjoy the garden terrace? It is cooler outside." Ethan blinked almost imperceptibly. Nobody had asked what he preferred in months. Decisions had quietly been made around him. Meals appeared according to someone else's schedule. Meetings were canceled without consulting him. His wheelchair was moved from room to room, as if it were expensive furniture instead of carrying a living man. "The terrace," he answered softly. Naomi smiled. "Very well, sir." She gently unlocked the wheelchair and guided him toward the open glass doors. The evening breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine across the stone terrace, replacing the heavy perfume and endless conversations inside the ballroom. Beyond the estate grounds, the Chicago skyline shimmered. Beneath the summer sky, its lights reflecting across the lake like scattered stars. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, breathing deeply. He had almost forgotten what fresh air felt like without someone rushing him back indoors. Naomi remained quietly beside him without speaking. She understood something many people never did. Kindness did not always require conversation. Sometimes dignity lived inside silence. Nearly 1 year earlier, Ethan Romano had stood in this very garden greeting governors, judges, and international executives with the calm confidence that came naturally to a man whose presence filled every room. At 6 feet 3 inches tall, dressed in tailored suits and carrying himself with effortless authority, he had built an empire through discipline, intelligence, and unwavering loyalty to the people who depended on him. Employees admired him because he remembered birthdays. Housekeepers respected him because he learned every name. Drivers trusted him because he never blamed others for honest mistakes. Although newspapers described him as mysterious and intimidating, those who worked inside the estate knew another side. Ethan believed respect traveled in every direction. Then everything changed within a single afternoon. A devastating traffic accident left his spine severely injured. Months of surgeries, rehabilitation, and relentless therapy saved his life but could not restore the movement in his legs. Doctors spoke carefully about possibilities. Physical therapists encouraged patience. Specialists refused to promise miracles. Ethan accepted each difficult conversation with remarkable composure, believing that determination would eventually overcome despair. What he had not prepared for was how quickly people would begin treating him differently. Invitations became less frequent. Conversations became shorter. Some business partners suddenly preferred speaking with attorneys instead of speaking directly to him. Employees who once sought his advice now looked toward assistance for permission. Even inside his own home, concern slowly transformed into careful distance. Victoria visited every rehabilitation session during the first month. By the third month, she often arrived late. By the sixth, she frequently canceled because of charity galas, fashion events, or important social commitments. She insisted she still loved him. Yet somehow every photograph she shared showed only herself smiling beneath bright lights while Ethan remained just outside the frame. Sitting beneath the evening sky, Ethan opened his eyes again as Naomi quietly adjusted the blanket across his knees to protect him from the cool breeze. She did not ask whether he needed help. She simply noticed what no one else had bothered to see. The following morning, the Romano estate awakened with the quiet precision of a luxury hotel. Before sunrise, gardeners trimmed hedges into perfect symmetry, chefs prepared breakfast in a kitchen large enough to serve a banquet, and security personnel rotated shifts with practiced discipline. Every clock inside the mansion seemed to follow the same invisible rhythm. Naomi Carter had already been working for nearly an hour, carefully polishing the hand-carved oak staircase that curved through the center of the residence. She admired the craftsmanship more than the wealth. Growing up in Detroit, she had learned to appreciate anything built to last because very little around her ever did. At exactly 7 o'clock, the head housekeeper, Margaret Ellis, gathered the domestic staff inside the service hallway for their morning assignments. Her silver hair was tied neatly beneath a crisp white cap, and her voice carried decades of experience. "Remember the rules," she said firmly. "The East Wing remains private unless instructed otherwise. Mr. Romano values order. Do not create unnecessary conversations. Perform your duties and remain professional." The staff nodded in agreement. Before dismissing them, Margaret looked directly at Naomi. "You are still new here. Another piece of advice. Do not become emotionally involved with Mr. Romano. He prefers privacy." Naomi offered a respectful smile. "I understand, ma'am." She truly intended to follow the instructions. Yet as the morning unfolded, she noticed something impossible to ignore. Several employees entered Ethan's study carrying documents but hurried back out within moments without exchanging more than a few words. Breakfast arrived precisely on schedule, was placed on the table, and removed untouched 45 minutes later. A physical therapist visited briefly before leaving with a polite expression that somehow looked more discouraged than hopeful. Everywhere Naomi looked, people completed tasks with flawless efficiency, yet no one actually stayed with him longer than necessary. Late that morning, while dusting bookshelves outside the library, she noticed Ethan sitting alone beside an enormous window overlooking the estate gardens. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass, illuminating rows of leather-bound books and antique paintings collected over generations. He held an open novel in his lap, but the page had not changed for nearly 20 minutes. He was not reading. He was simply watching autumn leaves drift across the stone pathways below. Naomi remembered something her grandmother had often said. Loneliness was easiest to recognize because it rarely made any noise. She walked quietly toward the library entrance and knocked gently on the open door before stepping inside. Ethan looked up with mild surprise. Most employees entered only after receiving permission. "Good morning, sir," Naomi said warmly. "May I dust the shelves in here, or would you prefer I come back later?" Ethan glanced around the spotless room before realizing she had given him a choice instead of assuming one. A faint smile appeared almost involuntarily. "You may continue." "Thank you, sir." Naomi worked carefully, moving from shelf to shelf without rushing. She did not pretend he was invisible, nor did she stare at him with uncomfortable sympathy. After several quiet minutes, she paused beside a display case containing dozens of framed photographs. Some showed Ethan shaking hands with community leaders. Others captured charity events, youth scholarship ceremonies, and hospital fundraisers. In every picture he stood tall, smiling confidently beside people from every walk of life. Naomi studied the photographs with genuine curiosity before looking back at the man seated beside the window. "You have helped a great many people," she said sincerely. Ethan looked at the photographs as though seeing them for the first time in months. "I tried." Naomi smiled softly. People usually do not keep smiling like that in photographs, unless someone made them feel seen. Her words were simple, almost effortless, yet they settled somewhere deep inside Ethan's heart. She had not complimented his wealth, his reputation, or the mansions surrounding them. She had noticed the person hidden behind every picture, and for reasons he could not yet explain, that simple observation mattered more than all the speeches delivered in his honor. Over the next several days, something inside the Romano estate began to change so gradually that almost no one noticed it at first. Every morning, just before 8 o'clock, Naomi would arrive outside Ethan's study carrying a neatly pressed jacket, polished shoes, and the day's schedule. She never entered without knocking. She never assumed what he wanted. "Good morning, sir," she would say with the same calm warmth. "Would you like to wear the navy suit today? Or the charcoal one?" It was always a choice, never a decision made for him. Ethan found himself answering questions that no one else had bothered asking for months. Which tie would he prefer? Would he like breakfast in the library or on the terrace? Did he want to review documents before meeting his attorney, or afterward? They were ordinary questions, almost insignificant on their own, yet together they restored something that physical therapy never could: control over his own life. Naomi also noticed the smallest details others overlooked. When she adjusted the cuffs of his jacket, she made certain they sat evenly beneath his sleeves instead of rushing through the task. Before placing a coffee cup within reach, She asked whether his right or left hand felt stronger that morning. If a book rested too far away, she quietly moved it closer without making him ask. Every gesture carried the same silent message. You are still capable. You still deserve respect. One afternoon, she found Ethan studying financial reports in the library, while sunlight streamed across the hardwood floor. A tray with lunch sat untouched beside him once again. Sir, Naomi asked gently, may I make one suggestion? Ethan looked up from the papers. Of course. You always finish your meetings before eating. The reports will still be here in 15 minutes, but your lunch will not stay warm. Ethan looked at the tray, then back at her. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. You sound remarkably confident for someone who has only been here a few weeks. Naomi laughed softly. My grandmother believed cold food made people grumpy. I never argued with her. Ethan surprised himself by laughing quietly. The sound was brief, almost unfamiliar but genuine. It was the first time several employees passing outside the library had heard laughter coming from that room in many months. Margaret Ellis paused in the hallway, exchanging a puzzled glance with another maid. What did she say to him? One whispered. Margaret simply shook her head. I do not think it was what she said. Meanwhile, Victoria's visits became increasingly predictable. She appeared whenever photographers, charity organizers, or influential guests scheduled appointments at the estate. She entered elegantly dressed, kissed Ethan lightly on the cheek, asked whether everyone was ready for the event, and disappeared before conversations became personal. On one occasion she interrupted lunch with a bright smile. Ethan, the magazine wants a few engagement photographs this afternoon. They would prefer natural lighting in the garden. Ethan nodded politely. If that is what you want. Victoria checked her watch. Wonderful. I have another meeting downtown first. They can prepare you while I am gone. She turned and left before waiting for his response. Naomi stood quietly beside the dining table, pretending to straighten the silverware until the room fell silent again. She did not criticize Victoria. She did not offer sympathy. Instead, she picked up the folded linen napkin and placed it neatly across Ethan's lap before sliding his untouched plate slightly closer. Your soup is still warm, sir, she said with the same gentle smile. And I believe warm food deserves at least one fair chance. Ethan looked at her for several long seconds before lowering his eyes toward the meal. For the first time in many weeks, he finished every bite. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet rhythm inside the Romano estate settled into a pattern that Ethan began looking forward to without ever admitting it aloud. Every morning Naomi greeted him with the same respectful smile, and every evening she wished him a peaceful night before finishing her duties. She never crossed professional boundaries, yet somehow her presence filled the enormous mansion with a warmth that expensive artwork and imported marble never could. Other employees noticed the difference as well. Ethan attended more meetings again. He spent longer hours in the library reviewing company reports. He even resumed walking his executive team through major decisions from his study, his sharp mind as disciplined as it had always been. The wheelchair had limited his movement, but it had never diminished his judgment. Unfortunately, not everyone welcomed those small signs of recovery. Victoria became increasingly occupied with public appearances, charity galas, luxury fashion events, and interviews celebrating what magazines described as the city's most admired power couple. Whenever photographers arrived at the estate, she appeared almost immediately, dressed flawlessly and smiling with effortless confidence. She stood beside Ethan for carefully arranged photographs, resting one graceful hand on his shoulder while speaking warmly about loyalty, commitment, and unconditional love. Yet the moment the cameras disappeared, so did her attention. One crisp Saturday afternoon, preparations were underway for another fundraising luncheon hosted at the estate. Staff hurried through polished hallways arranging fresh flowers and crystal centerpieces, while chefs completed the final menu. Ethan waited in the drawing room overlooking the front gardens, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit Naomi had prepared earlier that morning. She carefully adjusted the knot of his tie before stepping back with quiet satisfaction. You look distinguished, sir, she said sincerely. Ethan glanced toward the mirror. You have a talent for making complicated mornings feel simple. Naomi smiled modestly. I only pay attention to the details. Their conversation was interrupted when Victoria entered the room speaking into her phone. Without acknowledging either of them, she walked toward the large mirror and examined her reflection from several angles before ending the call. "The reporters should arrive in 20 minutes, she announced. "Ethan, make sure you stay near the fountain. The lighting is much better there." Ethan nodded politely. "If that works for everyone." Victoria turned toward Naomi for the first time. "And please make certain his blanket is folded neatly across his lap. Last month's photographs looked too clinical." Naomi remained composed. "Yes, Miss Hayes." Victoria adjusted one of her earrings before speaking again. "Also, try not to stand too close during interviews. We want the focus to remain on the family." She left almost as quickly as she had arrived, already answering another phone call before the door fully closed behind her. Silence settled over the room. Naomi quietly folded the blanket across Ethan's knees exactly as requested, smoothing each corner with practiced care. She never rolled her eyes. She never sighed. She simply completed her work with dignity. After several moments, Ethan finally spoke, his voice softer than usual. "Do you know what surprises me the most?" Naomi looked at him attentively. "No, sir." He gazed toward the gardens where workers were arranging white chairs beneath rows of blooming trees. "People often mistake appearances for affection. They assume standing beside someone means standing with them." Naomi considered his words before answering carefully. "Real care usually happens when nobody is watching." Ethan looked at her with quiet understanding. She had summarized the difference between performance and compassion in a single sentence. Outside, guests would soon arrive believing they were about to celebrate a perfect engagement. Inside the mansion, however, the distance between two hearts had never felt greater, while an unexpected bond built entirely upon simple respect continued growing stronger with every passing day. That evening, dark clouds gathered above the Romano estate, covering the last traces of sunset with a heavy blanket of gray. The weather forecast had mentioned scattered thunderstorms, but no one expected the storm to arrive so quickly. Rain hammered against the towering windows as fierce winds bent the old oak trees lining the long driveway. Inside the mansion, backup generators activated with a low mechanical hum after the neighborhood briefly lost power. Most of the household staff gathered in the main hall, waiting for instructions while security teams inspected the property. Ethan had remained upstairs in his private study, determined to finish reviewing a stack of financial reports before calling it a night. Naomi had just finished organizing the kitchen when Margaret approached her with concern. "The elevators are offline until the generators stabilize," Margaret explained. "Please let Mr. Romano know dinner will be delayed." Naomi nodded and immediately climbed the wide staircase toward the second floor. The mansion felt strangely quiet without its usual lights. Emergency fixtures cast soft amber shadows across the polished walls, making familiar hallways seem almost unfamiliar. As she reached the study, she found the door partially open. "Sir," she called gently. There was no answer. She stepped inside and immediately saw Ethan sitting beside his desk. His wheelchair had become wedged against the thick Persian rug after one of its front wheels caught beneath the edge. Several folders had slipped onto the floor beyond his reach. He looked toward her with calm embarrassment rather than frustration. "It appears I have been defeated by a rug," he said with a faint smile. Naomi smiled back. "I have seen much tougher opponents than that rug, sir." She carefully moved the chair backward just enough to free the wheel before kneeling to collect every document in the exact order they had fallen. She placed them neatly on the desk without asking unnecessary questions. Ethan watched every movement. She never treated helping him as an inconvenience. She treated it as ordinary kindness. Suddenly another announcement echoed through the hallway. The backup generator supplying the east wing required immediate maintenance, and everyone was instructed to relocate downstairs until technicians completed safety inspections. Margaret's voice carried from below. "Nobody remains on the second floor." Naomi looked toward Ethan. The elevator indicator remained dark. The maintenance supervisor spoke again over the intercom. Repairs could take more than an hour. Ethan quietly exhaled. "I suppose I will wait here until everything is restored." Naomi looked toward the long staircase leading to the first floor. Then she looked back at him with calm determination. "Sir, if you are comfortable trusting me, I have another idea. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What kind of idea? She smiled gently. One that gets you downstairs before your dinner gets cold again. Before he could object, Naomi carefully explained every step she intended to. The storm finally drifted east shortly after midnight, leaving the Romano estate wrapped in an unusual stillness. Rainwater shimmered across the stone pathways, reflecting the soft glow of restored garden lights, while the scent of wet pine and fresh earth floated through the open windows. Inside the mansion, dinner had long since ended, yet Ethan remained awake in the library, unable to stop replaying the evening in his mind. Throughout the past year, specialists had lifted him, therapists had supported him, and professional caregivers had followed every medical instruction with precision. But what Naomi had done felt completely different. She had never once looked at him as though he were broken. Early the next morning, Ethan found Naomi arranging fresh flowers in the breakfast room. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, turning tiny drops of water on the white lilies into sparkling crystals. "Good morning, sir," she greeted with her familiar smile. "I hope you were able to rest." Ethan studied her quietly before speaking. "May I ask you something personal?" Naomi nodded respectfully. "If I can answer, I will." He looked down for a moment, carefully choosing his words. "Last night you were not afraid. Most people hesitate before helping me. You never did. Why?" Naomi placed the flowers gently into the vase before folding her hands in front of her apron. For a few seconds, she simply watched the sunlight stretching across the hardwood floor. "Because I have seen what happens when people confuse disability with the loss of dignity," she answered softly. Ethan remained silent, sensing there was more. "My father served as a firefighter for nearly 25 years, she continued. "When I was in college, he suffered a severe spinal injury during a rescue. He survived, but he never walked again." Her voice stayed calm, yet every word carried the quiet weight of lived experience. At first, everyone visited. Friends brought meals. Neighbors offered encouragement. Then life became busy for them. The visits became monthly, then yearly, and eventually stopped altogether. Ethan listened without interrupting. Naomi smiled gently, not with sadness but with gratitude. "For 8 years I helped my father with the small things that everyone else believed no longer mattered. I asked which shirt he wanted to wear instead of choosing for him. I asked whether he wanted to watch baseball or read a book. I waited for his answers even when they took time." She looked directly into Ethan's eyes. "One day he told me something I have never forgotten. He said the hardest part was never the wheelchair. It was watching people slowly stop asking what he thought." The room fell completely silent. Ethan lowered his eyes as those words settled deep inside him. They described his own life with painful accuracy. Naomi stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "A king is not someone because he stands taller than everyone else. A king is someone who still protects the people around him, even when life becomes difficult. From everything I have heard, that is exactly who you have always been." Ethan felt his throat tighten. No award, newspaper article, or business achievement had ever affected him as deeply as that simple sentence. Naomi had not praised his wealth. She had not admired his influence. She had recognized his character. Outside the breakfast room, Margaret happened to pause while organizing the morning schedule. She heard only those final words before quietly walking away with a thoughtful expression. Something extraordinary was happening inside the Romano estate. It was not a miracle of medicine or fortune. It was the slow return of a man's belief in his own worth, restored one respectful conversation at a time. 1 week later, the Romano estate welcomed guests from across the country for what every newspaper described as the official celebration of Ethan and Victoria's upcoming wedding. Luxury sedans lined the circular driveway, reporters gathered beyond the security gates, and the grand ballroom once again glowed beneath towering crystal chandeliers. Soft piano music drifted through the room while executives, judges, philanthropists, and longtime family friends exchanged warm greetings over glasses of sparkling cider. Every detail had been arranged to project elegance, stability, and a future built upon perfect unity. Naomi stood quietly near the entrance with the household staff, ensuring every guest received the same courteous welcome. She had no expectation of being noticed, and she preferred it that way. Her satisfaction came from seeing every chair perfectly aligned, every place setting polished, and every visitor treated with respect regardless of title or wealth. Upstairs, Ethan adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit before looking into the mirror. Months earlier he would have dreaded another public event, but something inside him had changed. His wheelchair no longer defined the man reflected in the glass. Confidence had returned slowly, one decision and one conversation at a time. When Naomi knocked gently before entering with his jacket, Ethan smiled. "Is everything ready?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she answered. "Everyone is waiting for you. But there is no need to hurry. They can wait another minute if you wish." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Once again, she had given him something no one else seemed to remember to offer. Time on his own terms. Moments later he entered the ballroom to warm applause. Victoria crossed the room immediately, placing her hand lightly on his shoulder as photographers rushed forward. Flash after flash illuminated carefully rehearsed smiles, while guests congratulated the couple on their future together. After several photographs, the Master of Ceremonies invited Ethan to address the gathering before the symbolic signing of a commemorative engagement document prepared for the occasion. The room grew quiet as a leather portfolio was placed on the polished podium beside him. Victoria smiled confidently, certain the evening would unfold exactly as planned. Ethan opened the portfolio and slowly examined the pages. Then, instead of reaching for the decorative pen immediately, he looked across the ballroom. His eyes rested briefly on longtime business partners, loyal employees, and finally on Naomi, who stood discreetly near the back of the room believing she was completely unnoticed. Ethan closed the portfolio gently. "Before I sign anything," he began calmly, "there is something I have learned during the most difficult year of my life." Every conversation stopped. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. When success surrounds you, many people admire your strength. When hardship arrives, you discover who truly respects your humanity. Victoria's smile faded almost imperceptibly. Ethan continued with quiet confidence. "For many months I believed I had lost far more than the use of my legs. I believed I had lost the ability to choose my own future. I was mistaken." He reopened the portfolio, removed a single document, and signed it without hesitation. Then he handed it to Victoria. She glanced down, and the color slowly disappeared from her face. It was not an engagement confirmation. It was a formal statement ending their engagement by mutual legal agreement, prepared well in advance with his attorneys. No voices were raised. No accusations were spoken. The ballroom became so silent that the gentle fountain outside could be heard through the open terrace doors. Ethan turned toward the guests once more. A lifelong commitment should be built upon respect, not appearances. He looked toward Naomi with a grateful smile that carried more sincerity than any speech he had ever delivered. Across the room, dozens of people quietly followed his gaze, finally noticing the woman who had never asked for recognition yet had reminded one powerful man that true dignity could never be measured by weather. Someone stood on their feet or sat in a chair. Several months passed, and the Romano estate no longer felt like a place where people merely worked. It had become a home again. The laughter of employees drifted naturally through the hallways during lunch breaks. Meetings ended with genuine conversations instead of hurried departures. Even longtime business partners noticed the quiet transformation surrounding Ethan. He still relied on his wheelchair for much of each day, yet months of determined rehabilitation had strengthened his body beyond what many specialists had expected. Every morning began with physical therapy, followed by hours reviewing charitable foundations, scholarship programs, and community projects he had neglected while recovering. His priorities had changed. Success no longer meant controlling every outcome. It meant using every opportunity to restore hope in others. Naomi continued wearing the same simple black Maid uniform she had always worn. Despite the admiration she quietly earned throughout the estate, she never requested a promotion, special treatment, or public recognition. She greeted every gardener, every cook, every security officer with the same kindness she showed Ethan. Margaret often smiled as she watched younger employees imitate Naomi's quiet professionalism. Respect, she realized, had become contagious. One bright autumn afternoon, the estate hosted a community appreciation luncheon honoring teachers, firefighters, nurses, and volunteers from across Chicago. Instead of inviting celebrities, Ethan insisted the front tables be reserved for ordinary people whose daily service often went unnoticed. The ballroom looked just as magnificent as it had during countless elegant celebrations, yet somehow it felt warmer. Conversations sounded more sincere. Smiles appeared less rehearsed. As guests settled into their seats, Naomi quietly finished arranging the final place settings before preparing to leave through the side entrance as she always did. She believed the event belonged to the guests, not to the staff. "Naomi," Ethan called gently from across the room. She turned with quiet surprise. "Yes, sir." Every conversation slowly faded as he guided his wheelchair toward the center aisle. His physical therapist stood nearby, watching with hopeful eyes. Ethan placed both hands firmly on the armrests and took a slow breath. The room became completely silent. With careful determination and visible effort, he pushed himself upward until he was standing. His legs trembled slightly, but he remained steady with the support of a polished wooden cane resting beside his chair. It was only a few feet, yet every person present understood the courage those few feet required. Instead of walking toward the podium or the honored guests, Ethan took those careful steps directly toward Naomi. She instinctively moved forward, worried he might lose his balance, but he smiled reassuringly. When he finally reached her, he gently opened the dining room door with his own hand and stepped aside. "After you," he said warmly. Naomi looked at him with eyes filled with quiet emotion. "Sir, you do not have to do that." Ethan shook his head with a peaceful smile. "Yes, I do. Because every day you reminded me that dignity begins with the smallest acts of respect." Naomi entered the ballroom first, not as someone seeking attention, but simply as a person worthy of courtesy. The guests rose to their feet without anyone asking them to do so. The applause that followed was not loud because of wealth or influence. It was heartfelt because everyone had witnessed something far more valuable. They had seen gratitude expressed without pride and kindness rewarded without expectation. Ethan looked across the room at the people who had gathered that afternoon and realized the greatest victory of his life had never been measured by power, reputation, or recovery. It had begun the moment one quiet woman chose to see the man instead of the wheelchair. And on that beautiful autumn afternoon, everyone present remembered what true dignity looked like.